You know, we were everyone's in the media is obsessed with the Paris attack, but it's one of just a few terrorist attacks that's occurred in just the last week. You know, we had one in Beirut, we had one in Kenya just today, we had one in Nigeria, killed more than 30 people. You know, we didn't even make that big of a fuss when more than 200 Russian people died on the airliner in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Eric, why the big disconnect? Why do we care about this terrorist attack but don't care about the terrorist attack that killed even more people just a week before, or the one that happened the day before in Beirut?
I mean, it very simply boils down to prejudice, racism. Essentially, we're the
Russians
West,
are
we're
still
important.
white, right?
No, not really, though. Well, okay, yes, they're white, but in terms of historically, it's the East. It's part of the old communist bloc. Russia was always kind of on the edge and never really seen as part of the West unless you go back to, the era of Peter the Great or Catherine the Great, whenever they were maybe trying to westernize. But in modern day, if it's not the West, it's not news, and that's sad. But I mean, how many people die on a daily basis in Africa to the warlords, to terrorist groups? We don't even see anything about it. But at the moment one Western country gets attacked, it's all over the news, it's all we're talking about. And I think it speaks volumes to how our society approaches violence and how it's only important if it happens to us.
You know, I don't know if there was nothing about it. I mean, there was definitely quite a lot of coverage of the Beirut attacks leading up to Paris. But do you think that it's a media issue, or do you think that the media puts it out there, they don't see a response, and so they stop? You know, we live in a click economy. We work in the click economy. We see what's happening, and when Paris is getting a lot of clicks, we're going to stick with Paris. Do you think it's people or media?
Well, I think it's people. I think as a society, we just don't care as much as we should about the third world. It's one thing, to see an advertisement on TV about sending $1 a day to Africa or the violence, but in the end, we don't care. We tune out to what's going on over there because it doesn't affect our daily lives. France seems a lot more approachable because their culture may be slightly different, but they're a majority white country. They're Western in nature, the birthplace of, let's say, freedom and democracy in some sense. And so we see them as a lot more like us. Whereas when we look at a poor African country with rundown villages, no drinking water, it's just not the same. To us, it seems like another planet almost.
Peter, isn't that the problem? You know, we disregard the massive attacks and deaths in the Middle East and Northern Africa, and then we turn around and we're like, how could this happen, right in our back door in Paris?
It adds to the ISIS anti-imperialist, anti-Western narrative. That narrative says that the only thing that matters to the West is Western aims. And when non-Western people die, or when people the West doesn't really particularly care about, like the Russians die, it's just a blip on the radar screen. I mean, as you pointed out, the White House didn't light up in the colors of the Soviet flag, even though almost twice as many Russians died in the air crashes that died in
over
Paris.
220 people, yeah.
Yeah. So if you want to take it another half step, there's a darker explanation that's worth considering, and that is when you look at the way our government seeks to manipulate these events. For example, what happened in Paris means that we can't have encryption in the United States, because if the terrorists didn't use encryption, they'll certainly use encryption next time. The way this gets manipulated, it works a whole lot better the more similar the victims are to ourselves, the more we can project ourselves into that tragedy. And so people in the United States can't project themselves into a tragedy in Beirut. They can't project themselves into a tragedy in Nigeria. And, Russians are different. We don't like them. And the majority of Americans grew up under the communist threat and all that other stuff. So it's easy to kind of push them aside and dismiss them. But with Paris, we can project ourselves right into that disaster. In fact, one American was killed in Paris. And that becomes then to emotionalize the issue. Once you've got people inflamed emotionally, they become malleable. You can kind of put thoughts into their head and push them any direction you want to. And I suspect there are, in addition to the racist elements that Eric correctly brought up, I'm afraid that there are some very cold-hearted calculations that go into how these events can be used to manipulate our own society.